Okay, so this is the second video for chapter 5, and we're going to pick back up with Horace Mann. And again, I do want you to know about his efforts being the first Secretary of the State Board of Education, and also leading the Common School movement, which led to uh, free public, locally controlled elementary schools that we know today. I skipped on over to Justin Morrell's land grant schools on page 156, and I highlighted the first. There are only 2 paragraphs, but I highlighted the first paragraph, and it says that the Common School movement and the continuous settlement of the West stimulated the development for public higher education. So in 1862, the Morrill Land Grant Act, sponsored by Congressman Justin S. Morrill of Vermont, provided federal land for states either to sell or to rent in order to raise funds for the establishment of colleges of agriculture and mechanical arts. Each state was given a land subsidy of 30,000 acres for each representative and senator of a congressional delegation. That means someone in Mississippi established Alcorn State University, because Alcorn State University is the oldest land grant institution, college. So, and it could not have taken place without the birth of the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862. Okay, so now we're going to talk about segregation a little bit, and this is going to help you with your project of Brown v. Board. Segregation of schools on page 156, and it goes on to page 157. Okay, so we're still in the 1800s, and it says from the 17th to the late 20th century, schools were segregated by race. The first recorded official ground for school segregation dates back to the decision of the Massachusetts Supreme Court of 1850. When the Roberts family sought to send their daughter Sarah to a white school in Boston, the court ruled that equal but separate schools were being provided, and that Roberts therefore could not claim an injustice. This is the first educational segregation case, and this is called Roberts v. City of Boston in 1850. From the beginning, however, schools were not equal and students did not have equal educational opportunity. So we're going to get back to that. On the last part of that page, 157, I want you to know about the birth of kindergarten. This was birthed out of early childhood education, and after the Civil War, early childhood education kind of spread throughout, and a German educator named Frederick Froebel established what was called the kindergarten, and kindergarten literally means a garden where children grow. So I want you to make sure you highlight that. It stressed the motor development and self-activity of children before they began formal schooling at the elementary level. Through play, games, stories, music, and language activities, a foundation beneficial to a child's later educational and social development would be laid. So make sure that you remember that. Okay? I skipped on over to 158, and it talks about higher education for African Americans, and it's going to mention 2 key figures which I know you have heard before. The first one being Booker T. Washington, and the latter being W.E.B. Du Bois. I said B-E-D, didn't I? W-E-B-D. Yeah, W. Well, I'll get to it. I'm sorry. Okay, so Booker T. Washington was an author of the book Up From Slavery, and this recounts how he walked 500 miles from his home in West Virginia to attend Hampton Normal School. That was in Virginia. And this was one of the country's first institutions of higher education for African Americans. And 4 years after graduating from Hampton, Washington returned to be the school's first African American instructor. And of course, Booker T. Washington went on to establish Tuskegee Institute, which is now Tuskegee University in Alabama. Now, down at the bottom of that section, it goes on to say not all African Americans shared Washington's philosophy and goals. And I'm sorry, I messed his name up. His name was William E. Bernhardt Du Bois. Okay, so I don't know why I can't say it this morning. W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay, the first African American to be awarded a PhD and one of the founders of the NAACP. He challenged Booker T. Washington's views on education, and he also had a book called The Souls of Black Folks. He criticized educational programs that seem to imply that African Americans should accept inferior status and to develop manual skills. Du Bois called for the education of the most talented tenth of the African American population to equip them for leadership positions in society as a whole. Okay. Going on to the professionalization of teaching, I wanted you to know that the National Education Association, also called the NEA, which is the umbrella for MAE, which is Mississippi Association of Educators. This was NEA was founded in 1857, so it's a very old organization. I skipped over the next few sections and I went on to page 160 to the section, what were the aims of education during the Progressive Era, which is described from 1920 to 1945. So I want you to highlight the first paragraph, and it says, from the end of World War I to the end of World War II, education in the U.S. has influenced significantly by the philosophy of progressivism. Progressivism is a philosophical orientation based on the belief that belief that life is evolving in a positive direction, that people may be trusted to act in their own best interests, and that education should focus on children's interests and practical needs. And here's that name again, John Dewey. He could be considered the father of the progressive movement. I want you to know that, go on to page 161. And it says at the top of the page that Dewey states that schools and society were connected and that teachers must begin with the understanding of the child's world, the psychological dimension, and the progress of the logical dimension represented by accumulated knowledge of the human race. Another type of school that was founded under the Progressive Era was a Montessori school, and there's still schools like this today. Marie Montessori's method, and I want you to highlight in that first section there and the last section, and I have here, progressive educators in Europe were similarly developing new approaches that would also affect U.S. education. Chief among these was Maria Montessori, who was an Italian physician who was influenced by Rousseau and believed that children's mental, physical, and spiritual development could be enhanced by providing them with developmentally appropriate educational activities. So here's the crux of the Montessori school. Montessori teachers are prescribed sets of materials and physical exercises to develop students' knowledge and skills, and students are allowed to use or not to use the materials as they see fit. The materials arouse students' interest, and the interest motivates them to learn. Through highly individualized instruction, students develop self-discipline and self-confidence. Okay, so again, progressivism is child-centered. Okay. I'm going to skip over to page 163, which talks about World War II and the increasing federal involvement in education. So just as the church had a strong hand on how education was to be impacted, to be implemented, so did the U.S. government once it was established. But not so more much as well, not so more much. That's not a phrase that I want to use, but what I'm trying to say is simply that during the time of the Great World Wars, especially World War II, the U.S. government had a strong, firm grip on education, and there are reasons why. So World War II, and I'm on the end of page 163, and I highlighted those two paragraphs, which takes you on to page 164. The Lanham Act of 1941 provided, I believe it's three things. The first thing was training of workers in war plants by U.S. Office of Education Personnel. 2, the construction of schools in areas where military personnel and workers on federal projects resided. And 3, the provision of child care for children of working parents. It says another influential and extensive program in support of education was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. And for those of you that are in the military, you probably know this name. And for those of you who are not in the military, you definitely know this name, GI Bill, or the GI Bill of Rights. But those in the military may know the history behind it. It was called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. It was signed into law by FDR in 1944. The GI Bill provided millions of veterans with payments for tuition and room and board at colleges and universities and at special schools. Similar legislation was passed through the other major wars, such as Vietnam and Korean Wars. But the GI Bill did two things. It said that it not only did it stimulate the growth of American colleges and universities, but it also changed how those colleges and universities looked, because returning veterans who took advantage of the GI Bill were older and they were more serious students, more serious than students that had not served in the military. Okay. So how did education change during the modern post-war era? And they calculate that as being from 1945 to 2000. Okay. So we're going to talk about the 1950s. And the 1950s, and we're going to go on through the decades. But the 1950s is going to take you through two very influential acts in education. The first one being Sputnik. President Obama mentioned and coined the phrase, "This is our Sputnik moment." This is something that changed the face of education in the 50s. And I highlighted that first paragraph under that. It said that teachers and education were put in the spotlight in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched the first space satellite called Sputnik into space. Stunned, U.S. leaders immediately blamed the space lag on inadequacies in the education system. It said that the Soviet Union was the first into space, and it was because the schools had long been under the sway of progressive education. So they said that students that have control over the curriculum is not a good thing, because they're going to shy away from these things that are very important, like science, math, chemistry, all of these things that help make astronauts and rocket scientists and things of that nature. So when Sputnik launched, this was a huge blow to U.S. morale. And they're like, because at that time we were going through the Cold War, which is with Russia. And they could not believe, Americans at the time could not believe that someone beat us. That was the mentality. And they said, okay, this cannot happen again. So what they did was, if you look on page 165, they passed something called the National Defense Education Act of 1958, where the federal government appropriated millions of dollars over the next decade for educational reforms that reflected the importance of teaching knowledge and skills that were viewed as essential for adult life. So it focused on research and innovations in science, math, modern foreign language, and guidance. And I want to say this as a footnote, that this era was the birth of guidance counselors, because at the time there really was no one in school that could direct you toward your aptitude. So if you had an aptitude toward math or science or whatever, they created guidance counselors to say, okay, you're good at math, you're good at science, let's try to steer you into engineering, let's try to steer you into chemistry or foreign language if you were good at foreign languages, so ultimately you could be a spy. So this was all to help bolster America still being a superpower. During the reform activity of the 60s, public enrollment rose dramatically. In 1950, about 25 million children enrolled. Okay. No, don't worry about that. I highlighted that by accident. Let's go on to something else. Okay, so I said that there were two major incidences that coined the 1950s. Sputnik and Brown v. Board, or the whole title is Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. So on page 166, I want you to highlight the last two paragraphs under that section before you get to the 1960s. The end of World War II also saw the beginning of school desegregation. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected the separate but equal doctrine that had been used since the court case of Roberts in 1850 as a justification for excluding African Americans from attending schools with whites. In response to a suit filed by the NAACP on behalf of a Kansas family, Chief Justice Earl Warren declared that to segregate school children from others of similar age and qualifications solely based on race generates a feeling of inferiority as to the status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. That's where the Dahl test came into play. So that was very instrumental in helping that. One of the lead attorneys that I hope you've heard this name before was named Thurgood Marshall. And of course, he ended up becoming a justice on the Supreme Court. But he was one of the lead attorneys in Brown v. Board. Also, as a footnote, Chief Justice Earl Warren, who made that statement that I just read to you, he was for those of you that may be an assassination buff of JFK, which I am, have you ever heard of the Warren Commission? He was responsible for heading up the investigation on the assassination of JFK. And out of that came a very famous theory called the magic bullet theory, which specified that there was this one bullet that made like 6 or 7 wounds in the president and the governor that was sitting in the car with him. So it's very, very controversial. It's about 20-something volumes, and it's named the Warren Commission after this gentleman here, Chief Justice Earl Warren. Okay. The Supreme Court's decision did not just bring an immediate end to segregated schools, though the court 1 year later ordered that desegregation proceed with all deliberate speed. So in other words, people were dragging their feet on this decision. Though I already read that part. Opposition to school integration arose in school districts across the country. Some districts whose leaders modeled restraint and a spirit of cooperation desegregated peacefully. Other districts became battlegrounds characterized by boycotts, rallies, and violence. And of course, you know, in the South, you have the Little Rock Nine. Okay, you had, if you've ever seen Mississippi burning, you had the whole state of Mississippi was against desegregation. So Alabama, Georgia, all the southern states were very much against desegregation. Okay, so we're going to end there and we're going to pick back up with the 1960s, and it's going to go by decades to bring us up to current.